All right, so we have a Toro recycler 22-inch walk behind self-propel mower, and basically couldn't start it up. We just pull, couldn't start it up. So shot some starter fluid in it. It would fire up for a second and then die. So then that tells me that we have some kind of fuel delivery issue and or carburetor issue. I've already checked the fuel in this, and the fuel actually looks nice and good and clean. And in order to even check fuel flow, which is the next step I'm going to do real quick, I got to pull the fuel line off the carburetor on this side. So I'm going to grab a pair of pliers. We're going to pull the air filter off. We're going to disconnect the fuel line, do a quick fuel flow check, and if that looks good, then we're going to go ahead and remove and clean that carburetor. So let's get this air filter removed. And then take the air filter cover, or not the cover, but the housing. There's one screw, and then there's this one. Oop. And this is 5/16.
My customer number is 721520.
There we go. And then we're gonna pull, if we can, we're gonna pull this off and out of the way. And on this, which is kind of weird, I haven't seen it like, looks like there's a couple screws there. So I'm just gonna use, there's 2 Phillips screws it looks like, I think, on the top. We're gonna just pull that off and move it out of the side. That way we just have a little bit more room to work with things. Set that screw aside. Take that one out. And then that way we can just kind of tuck it and move it out of the side. But it looks like, oh, they plastic welded this one. Usually I've seen them where there's a screw right here. You can just take that screw out and then you rock it and you can take that off, but not on this one apparently. Okay, so now that we got that off, here's our fuel line. We have, it's a gravity fed system. So it goes from gas tank, the bottom of the tank, fuel line over to carburetor. And I'm gonna disconnect that fuel line and we're gonna take a quick peek at what fuel flow is like. So what I like to do is take some channel locks. Don't get them super tight, but just enough where you can kind of pinch that fuel line off. You can get fuel line clamps, but these work just fine. You just got to be careful. Just don't get too crazy on the clamp. So all I'm doing is I'm moving the clip, and then I'm rotating the fuel line to disconnect it. And then we're going to take a quick sample. And in fact, I want to see what it looks like. Just take a quick sample of the fuel too while we're at it. Got plenty of flow. And it doesn't look bad at all. Actually, I see down in there what looks like some water. But it's kind of hard to see with this kind of cup, this clear cup here. So I'm gonna set this aside real quick. Let me dump this. So we did a fuel flow test. Flow looks great. The fuel actually doesn't look bad. There is a little bit of something in there. So usually that settles on the bottom. When I look down in the gas tank, it looks clear, it looks fine. I don't see any issues with any of the fluids. It looks great. So I feel it's isolated down to the carb. So we're going to go ahead and take this carb off. In order to take this off, there's quite a few things going on here. We have a air vane choke for an auto choke. In order to take that off, there's a little spring here. We're going to disconnect it. I'm going to leave it hanging right over there. And then we got to loosen this and pull the bolt out. So let me get the right. Just like so, and then the vane, well, I may not be able to pull it out to really show you, but just keep note that there is this little bar that comes down that connects right in between for the choke to move it forward and backward. So we're going to leave that up and off to the side, and we're going to pull the collared bolt off to the side, and then on here we're going to have to take these two bolts off. Those I think are 3/8. Let me grab 3/8 here. There we go. Okay, now before I take this off all the way, I like to kind of clean the outside real quick so I'm not getting debris and stuff in the carb or into the engine and stuff. But before I do clean that, I'm gonna pull the spring off because I really don't want to lose it. And it just kind of just hooks over on that little hook right there. So I'm gonna set that spring aside and I'm gonna get a little bit of mineral spirits. And then we'll get this cleaned up. Let me grab my air. There we go. Sometimes you got to do the little dance. All right, so get this cleaned up. What I like to do is put my thumb over the intake just to make sure you're not getting debris and stuff in there. Normally I do this ahead of time, but I got a little ahead of myself. And then just watch your eyes, of course. Okay, clean it a little bit more. There we go. All right, so now that I got all that junk off of there, I'm gonna go ahead and loosen up the bolts. And as I'm loosening it, I'm going to slowly pull it back, because what happens is when I have my socket on the bolt, it can get stuck behind the carburetor, and so sometimes you have to pull it towards you a little bit just to prevent that from happening. There we go. Pull that bolt out, pull that bolt out, and they're both the same. Now we can take the carb and kind of rock it gently and out of the throttle lever. Now, what I mean by gently is because this is plastic and you really don't want to bust these. It's just not a good time. Now is a good time to go ahead and check that gasket for the intake. and make sure everything looks good there, and it does. So all that looks good. So we're gonna go ahead and now start to tear apart this carburetor. And before I tear it apart, I just finished cleaning it, closing over, putting my thumb over the intake, both sides of the carb, just to help kind of reduce the junk that I'm gonna get from blowing and cleaning the outside of this carb. I've seen some where they were just so caked, like with several inches of all kinds of stuff. And so there we go. And then what I do is being careful. I try not to take these gaskets off or mess these gaskets up by jarring them and stuff, but I do inspect them, make sure that they do look okay and everything looks good. So this side is the throttle side, this is the choke side, and everything's flush here, even if the throttle plate is opened all the way, and there's nothing impeding on the outside here. So usually what I'll do is I'll set them down like that, push down, and then making sure this is for removing the bolt, push down, and then torque it to loosen it up. Sometimes those are on there really tight, and so if you're holding it here, it can get a real pain just to take off. Okay, so now get this bolt off, which is also our main jet on these. Okay, so now we'll start with this. We're gonna go ahead and just clean this up a little bit more now that we got it all apart. On the inside, actually, it doesn't look bad. And just because it doesn't look like you have fluids in there and stuff, doesn't mean that it was bad gas, it wasn't bad gas. It could have been bad gas that was in here, but since that looks pretty clean, what I'm willing to bet is that this main jet is plugged on these carburetors. The main jet is part of this bolt here, the float bolt, and how it works is fuel comes in through the sides here, and the main jet is that center port right there. So I got to clean that, and let me grab the appropriate wire size. And when you do this, don't force anything in, just be gentle, make sure it goes in nicely, make sure this goes all the way through like it should, and all of this is looking good now. So then what I'll do is I'll blow air in these directions. And there could have been bad gas in this, by the way, because we did see some what looked like a little bit of water in that. So there was potential of there being bad gas in this, along with this main jet being restricted. So then what I like to do is go ahead and take the needle or the float pin out, and then pull the whole float with this needle out, and I'm going to set that aside there, and then usually I'll blow through here, which is your fuel in, and then this is where your needle seats, and then I'll blow down where the emulsion tube is. In this case, on this one, the emulsion tube you may not be able to get pulled out. Let me just double check. Not all of them you can push out. This one you can't. It's actually pressed in here. So sometimes I'll just go through and just make sure I can see my wire go through all the way like so, just showing that it is clear. And again, on these, you don't want to ream them out. It's not a big deal if you ream that out a little bit on this, as it is for the main jet. The main jet's extremely important. And then on this one, this carburetor is also an older one, and it has a little gasket down in there, essentially for the seat of this needle. And what can happen is those can swell up so bad that you're not excuse me, you're not getting any fuel coming through there. And when normally when that happens, you can't even see the hole. It's so small, and it's just ballooned looking, that gasket. So this actually looks fine. I don't see any issues with it, so I'm not going to mess with that. And then same thing with this gasket for the float bowl. Everything looks good. I try not to take these off unless I absolutely have to, because I don't want to mess them up. And most of the time you don't have to take them off, and everything's just fine. So now I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this needle. This needle is all completely solid. And what I'm doing is I'm looking along each side, making sure there's no fuel varnish on there that's sticky, or any varnish that's going to keep it from sliding up and down in this cavity, because it should just slide in and out nice and freely. And that looks good now. So everything looks good with this float. Rarely do I see them get gas in these. Usually that's if you have a little hole. Rarely do I ever see that, but I have seen it happen. So you just want to make sure the float is good and everything looks good. And now we got to get the needle reinstalled into this float, and to do that, it goes into that little groove right in there. So now I hold it upside down, and then we're going to go ahead and get it into where the needle seats, and then with it gently sitting there, line up this pin and they float, and they go in just like so. Now, to check, what I always do is make sure when you flip it upside down like this and this way, that it's moving, and it is. And then another, when you have it upside down like so, it should be almost level. It's okay if it's just a little bit that way, and I wouldn't let it go more beyond level, meaning that it's negative, going down a little bit, because more often than not when I see that, it's not stopping the fuel flow at a proper time, and you can have rich issues among other issues. So make sure it's at least close to level, if not just hair that way on these mowers, I should say. Now, if I wanted to be more picky and make this more level, then what I would have to do is I would have to break out my heat gun, and I would have to heat this end up a little bit, and then push this pin down, cool it, and then, or I mean pull it up, I'm sorry, in this case it'd be pulling it up a little bit, then cool it, and usually I'll hit some air over it, hold it like so, and then check it. Unfortunately, that's what you have to do with these plastic ones. Technically, they're not adjustable other than replacing them, but that's what I have done. But if you do that, you have to be very careful. Don't get crazy on the heat, because you'll blow a hole through these and soften things up and really mess them up. Okay, so now that we know that this is all working as it should, I'm going to go ahead and put this float bowl back on. And I always apply a little bit of seafoam on these paper-like gaskets, because when you go to tighten these down, you'll probably, if you go too hard or they're just dry, you have a higher tendency to rip them. And even though I have a whole bunch of them, I try not to damage these. And you can do that by just applying a little bit of a lubricant, and then I'll get it snug like so, and then you can get a little bit on there. Okay, so now that all this is back together, everything looks good. We're gonna go ahead and reinstall it. Same gig here, we have an O-ring that seats inside this area right here. And then let me make sure I have my bolts ready. Okay, so when we go to install this, it's kind of the reverse of everything we've done. We got to make sure we tilt this carburetor over like so, and then pop it in place. You shouldn't have to force anything. If you're forcing something, then something's not right, and stop. Check it over, make sure you're getting it done right. Because you'll break this. I've broken, a few in my past to know better. Okay, like I was saying earlier, what can happen is sometimes these sockets will get stuck or not, you won't be able to get it, so I got to pull it back a little bit. On this side it's more picky, and then I'm just going to get it just snug enough that's kind of holding it, and then get my other bolt in. I'm going to loosen this side up a little bit so I have a little bit more room to a little bit more to work with. There we go. And then just go a little bit. Don't go crazy. Just a little bit. There we go. Now that's all nice and snug or tight. Okay, so now we got to reinstall our choke, auto choke. And to do that, you got to line it back up in here like so. Slide that down, and then snug this up. Same gig, you don't want to go crazy tight, and that's what's nice about using a screwdriver form versus a wrench. You have more leverage, so you can easily over torque, whereas these, they're a lot harder to over torque, because you would have to put quite a bit of torque on that, whereas this, you could easily snap that pretty good. Okay, so now that we got this reinstalled and this choke valve is moving like it should, when I move this, we got to make sure it's auto retracting, and we took the spring off. So to get that spring back on, over there in the back, and then I got to bring that all the way back up here like so. Now if I pull on it to open it, it opens up. And how this works is when it fires off, the engine fires up, the air's getting blown that way, so it's pushing this open and opening the choke, and that's how that works. And then if you ever want to adjust your engine RPMs, how that works is you bend this out or in. Now when you do this, take care in not over revving the engine. You really don't want to high rev these engines and stuff. They're built for X RPMs, and make sure that you're running within that range. You can over rev them if you're not taking care of it. Okay, so now that we got the carburetor reinstalled, we're going to go ahead and reinstall this fuel line. I just want to take a larger sample now that it's sat. See, that looks more cloudy, but that could have mixed up some stuff. So I'm gonna empty this real quick. Okay, so I'm taking a larger sample. I wanna make sure this fuel looks good. And it actually looks good there. So when I took the sample in this, and I took it again, I noticed it looked a lot more cloudy, but I do know that there was some water in there. So when it was pouring in there, it was kind of agitating it. So the whole thing kind of got cloudy. And it's kind of hard to see with this plastic. So that's why I grabbed the dog bowl. I use these all the time. I love these. And I'm looking and it looks really good overall. So gas is good. And we're gonna reconnect our fuel line. Disconnect that. Make sure our hose clamp is reinstalled properly. And now we have our air filter retainer. So I'm making sure that all this is clear right here where it sits. And then here's our breather tube. So this here is what we call our breather tube. And that connects here like so. The reason for the breather tubes connected to the air filter housing is because of EPA's, from what I understand. EPA doesn't like it venting to atmosphere. They want to see everything kind of sealed, and whatever, you know, emissions that might be emitting, you're burning it off essentially. So that's the reason, generally speaking, why they have the breather tube always attached to the air filter housing, from my understanding. And then, so once we get those two bolts on there and tightened up, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of clean this inner part of this air filter a little bit, because it looks a little dirty and it shouldn't be dirty on the inner side. And I don't like to ingest dirt or anything. It just adds to, and it could have been from the old air filter or whatever. Okay, so now we put the air filter on, and how this works, air filter just seats in there like so. Then this comes up and then it bolts down just like that. So we now need to reinstall this cover, and there's usually a little clip here. Sometimes there's something up here, but it looks like it's just the one clip here. And then of course you have a hole here and a hole here where these two plastic screws are. So I'm just gonna make sure all of that is lining up as it should. I'm grabbing my Phillips, put the screw in. Now with these plastic screws, don't go crazy on them. Just get them snug, because you can't exactly fix those. I mean, you could try jamming, you know, other things in the hole to help, but it just doesn't hold the way it should. All right, so that's snug, and usually what you can do is you can grab it and you can kind of move it and see if it slides around. If it slides around, it's not right. Okay, so now that we went through the carb and everything, I'm gonna go ahead and wipe all of that debris off the mower. And then we are gonna go ahead and fire this up. Okay, so we're gonna take this outside. I'm gonna fire it up. I don't like firing things off in the shop when it comes to mowers and everything, because usually there's a lot of grass and stuff packed underneath them. And it just shoots that stuff everywhere in the shop. Okay, so let's go ahead and fire it up. What I like to do too, as a extra test, is I have a zip tie that you can clip and it holds. Well, it generally holds. Yeah, there we go. And then you can press it to release it. And what I do on those cases is I'll just loop it around like so, just to hold this down. I like to use the green ones to remind me that I have mine on there, to take it off later. So what I like to do is start them up, let them run for a while in the background while updating my notes, and then if it continues to run just fine during that whole time, then everything's good, generally speaking. Rarely do I see issues extending from that, and usually if that's the case, it's a complete different issue, and we have more data on that generally, which could lead down to a spark plug or a coil in those cases usually. So I'm going to go ahead and fire this up, and then I'm also going to test the self-propel, just make sure everything's working. And then I can take that off, and then I'm going to put it back on and let it run a little. So for the sake of the video, I'm not gonna sit here letting it run for a while. I'll do that, with the video off. In case you're wondering, this cable is normal length. There's a little retainer here keeping it from retracting any further. So it is on this particular mower. That's how long it is. So there's nothing wrong with this, in case you're wondering. But anyway, that's how you go ahead and remove and clean the carburetor. Biggest thing is, if you can shoot some starter fluid in it and it fires up for a second and then dies, more than likely it's going to be a carburetor issue. About 90+% of things I see come in here are a carb issue. It's just how carburetors for small equipment work. They don't like to sit for a long period of time. With today's fuel, standard pump fuel. You can go to ethanol free, but I'm not a pusher of that, and that doesn't even necessarily guarantee you're not going to have carb issues. Biggest thing I always recommend to my customers, fire these up once a month, let them run for 10-15 minutes, keep the gas low during the off season, and just add a little bit as necessary. During your mow season, fill it up, use it, whatever, but in the end, fire them up at least once a month. Keep those fluids kind of circulating. You can always put a bungee over this, which is one thing that we recommend to our customers, or you can get these resettable zip ties. And if you do that, do take care, make sure there's no animals or kids around. Don't leave the things unattended without you being close by, just for safety purposes.